Hi, this is Mark Graban, and I'm excited to share this video by Michael Lombard on initiating experiments through a Kaizen field practice of kata. So let's jump right in and hear from Michael.
So there's this idea that I believe in, which is that all ideas are not created equal. And by that I mean the way that we approach improvement matters. It's not just about what was the result on the process. Did we improve the efficiency or reduce cost or whatever? That's important, of course, but the way we go about doing that matters. And my hypothesis is that if we approach improvement in a way that really has a high intensity of developing our people, which is shown on the horizontal axis of this graph, then that increases the overall impact of having pursued that idea. And I'm going to walk through kind of these three scenarios. So in red, let's say we approach an improvement effort in a way that does not really develop our people at all. Let's say we have a vendor come in and prescribe a technological solution to an issue, then we're going to get some great process improvement out of that, but that's about the extent of the impact that we're going to feel as an organization. However, if we were to approach that in a slightly different way, this would be the yellow box. Let's say we engage staff in the process of tackling an issue, and maybe we do a quality circle or a rapid improvement event, a Kaizen event. Then we're going to get a little extra bump from that. We're going to get that staff engagement component, and that's incredibly valuable, of course. The esprit de corps that's developed from that type of event, the team building that occurs from that type of event is all enhancing the impact of that improvement endeavor. However, once the event's over, we're kind of back to business as usual, maybe with just a little bit more of a bounce in our step. But if we were to approach the improvement effort in a way that really intensely focuses on developing our people, that's the green box, we not only get the PI, the process improvement, and the SE, the staff engagement, but we can actually approach improvement in a way that develops new mindsets. Now, to do that, there's a lot of science behind that, cognitive science, about what it takes to change habits and form new neural pathways. And I encourage everybody, if you go look on my YouTube website, you can find some really great videos on the topic of neuroplasticity and that sort of thing from other sources. But anyway, if we approach improvement in that fashion, the overall impact is radically better. So indeed, all ideas are not created equal. And I believe, my contention is that that green box is where we see traditional Kaizen approach to improvement, and I think Kata also has a role to play with really intensely developing our people. So we're going to move to the next slide now, Mark.
And this is where I'll jump in. Michael did ask me to touch briefly on principles of Kaizen, or continuous improvement. You know, Kaizen, of course, being a Japanese word that translates to mean basically, quite literally, good change or improvement or change for the better. This is something that Joe Schwartz and I have both done a lot of work on and have written about. But some of the key principles of Kaizen is, first off, at least the goal of engaging everybody in improvement. At Joe's organization, his health system in Indianapolis, they have reached close to 50% participation rates, submitting and implementing and documenting at least one Kaizen into their process in a given year. So overall, they've had something like 2/3 of their employees participate at least once. Their leadership challenge is to try to get more people involved and to get them participating to try to help be a little bit better every day. Not just to do one Kaizen, not just to set some sort of target or goal, but to really have it become the culture. And that's really something that is quite noticeable in some of the departments in the Franciscan St. Francis Health System. People love talking about improvement. They point out problems, and that's celebrated as opposed to something that's punished or covered up. And I think another key thing about Kaizen as opposed to suggestion box systems is that suggestion boxes tended to ask people, what's your suggestion? And those suggestions were generally things for other people to implement. Leaders would just approve or reject ideas. Where in a Kaizen process, we start with defining a problem or an opportunity for improvement. And then we follow the plan, do, study, adjust cycle, or some people call it PDCA, of plan, identify the problem or opportunity, understand it better, decide what we're going to then do, and then study the effects of that change. Was it really a good change or not? And then we can adjust accordingly to either help document and spread and share the idea, or to go back and adjust and try something again else or something new to help further address that problem. And to make all of that happen, leadership really is key. How do we react when people speak up? Do we collaborate with them? Do we coach? The drive and the energy that comes from leaders at all levels is really critically important. So hopefully I did that in 5 minutes or less. That's my introduction to Kaizen. Michael, is there anything that you would want to add to this before moving on to Kata?
That was actually 2 minutes and 22 seconds, Mark. Good job.
Okay. I yield my time to the gentleman from Dallas.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. And I think I figured out how to advance the slides on my own now. Let's try it real quick. So with that overview, that quick overview of, oh, maybe I didn't. Okay, so if you could please advance it for me, Mark.
Sure. We have something to troubleshoot, but we'll do that later rather than interrupting the webinar. So here we go, Michael.
Very good. So now that Mark's provided that quick overview of Kaizen, and a lot of you are probably already familiar with the principles of Kaizen, I'm going to present a quick overview of Kata. And if you don't know it, there was a book written called Toyota Kata by Mike Rother, and out of the University of Michigan. And he, for years and years, studied kind of what is the secret sauce for organizations like Toyota. How do they develop the people on the front lines that can lead improvement efforts in a methodical, scientific manner? And how do they develop coaches that can teach those principles? And what he came up with were some principles and some techniques that are embodied in the book. And just to kind of summarize some of those principles in a couple of slides and a couple of bullet points, I'll touch upon a few here. First one, I would summarize Kata basically as the scientific method, but with some direction added to it. So a Kata practitioner is always thinking, what is the long-term direction in which we're headed? And then working back from that and saying, well, what is that challenge that we're trying to achieve in the next 6 months to a year or two? And then working back from that and saying, well, what is the target condition that I want to be at in the next couple of weeks or couple of months? And then even further working back from that and saying, what is the next obstacle that I need to tackle? So it's PDCA or PDSA with direction applied to it. The second bullet point is it's the scientific method with deliberate practice added to it. There's a science and technique to deliberate practice that differs from just practice. And deliberate practice helps us speed up the acquirement of new mindsets or the rewiring of your brain, so to speak. And so Kata has a little bit of that infused into it, or a whole lot of that, I should say. And I want to point out that I'm going to go into the next slide on what we call the Improvement Kata, and it's a set of routines that we perform to lead improvement, but I want to point out that it's not just another process improvement technique like other methodologies, maybe DMAIC. I was trained on doing DMAIC as part of Six Sigma, and incredibly effective at leading improvement, but the Improvement Kata is not designed just to create process improvement. It's designed to create new habits, new ways of thinking, and so it's a little bit different in that regard. It has a kind of a different calling, if you will. Here are the 4 routines of the Improvement Kata. Nothing fancy here. It's really about the repetition of it more than anything. But I'll go real quick through the 4 routines. So first, stop to understand the direction or challenge. And there's a skill to that. There's a technique to that you start off, you're not very good at it. In your organization, may not be very good at potion planning and those sorts of things. But the more you practice this routine, the more strategic you start to think. The second routine, grasp the current condition. Nothing new there to anybody that's led improvement work the right way, but there's a little nuance there in that in the Kata approach, it's more of an action-oriented approach to grasping the current condition where we'll do rapid cycles of PDCA just to go to Gemba. We'll treat going to Gemba and observing a process or collecting data or mapping a process as a little experiment in and of itself. So it's more of an empirical approach to grasping the current condition. Then establishing the next target condition is, you can view that as what is the bite of the apple that we want to take? Where do we want to be in the next couple of weeks or a month or two? And there's a technique to that as well, and it involves treating the act of consensus building as experiment, and the act of figuring out what performance level you want to achieve in the next target as an experiment. And then the fourth routine is iterating toward the target condition. Basically, once we know what our target is, there's a series of obstacles that we're going to have to just navigate through rapid cycles of PDCA. And the next slide, I think, kind of elaborates upon that a little bit. There's this concept of the gray zone within the kata, and it's that basically we're not assuming that we know what the direct path is from current to target, and we don't care. We relish in the gray zone. We enjoy the gray zone because that's the learning zone. And we're going to take side trips. We're going to go off in the wrong direction for a cycle or two, but we're going to ultimately iteratively progress toward the target condition. And so when you start to view things this way, it's about how fast can you do that next learning cycle, that next PDCA cycle. And so you go from doing 30, 60, 90-day cycles or pilots of PDCA to 30, 60, 90-minute cycles, more rapid cycle. And that's kind of a fundamental premise of kata. And then on the next slide.
And I was just going to interject real quickly, Michael. This whole idea of the gray zone and that fog or that uncertainty reminds me of an author I've gotten exposed to the last couple of years. He's a professor at Harvard, Ronald Heifetz, and he talks about the difference between technical change and adaptive change. And a technical change is something relatively simple that has a definitive path and set of steps. You know, if you follow these steps, you will accomplish that goal, and you know you're done. So let's say if I wanted to swap out the hard drive in my computer, that's a technical change. It's known how to do that, and there are a certain number of steps. In organizations, adaptive changes are more complex, and what Heifetz describes is basically this idea of iterating your way through the adoption of a change. And most changes in the workplace, I think, are arguably adaptive changes that we may have a direction, or what Kata calls the target condition, and we have an idea about how we'll get there, but each step isn't planned out exactly. And Heifetz makes the point that organizations err in treating adaptive challenges like technical challenges. I'm curious if you have any reaction or comment to that.
I think that's incredibly well said. I think the professor's work is excellent, and your description of it is great, and that definitely captures the essence of the mindset that we're trying to create through kata. Because again, kata is not a process improvement technique. It's not a tool to have in your toolbox. It's something you do, and the purpose of doing is to get repetition, to start to teach organizations how to think in terms of navigating through the gray zone and this adaptive change mindset. So I think that's very well said, Mark.
Okay.
So there's also this component of kata, which is the coaching kata. So as the learner is practicing the improvement kata, the coach is practicing the coaching kata. And it consists of planning coaching cycles and executing coaching cycles. And what starts to happen is the more you do coaching cycles in the role of coach, the more you start to realize that indeed every step you take is an experiment, not just as the learner trying to facilitate process improvement, but as the coach trying to hone your coaching craft. And so you start to become a better coach faster, and you start to be more scientific in the way you approach your coaching. And so now we're all just practicing the scientific method in one form or another, and that's a pretty powerful cultural shift that you start to see within practice of the kata. And so with that, that's kind of an overview just at the very highest level of the kata approach, the improvement kata and coaching kata. But that was all just kind of to set up the next slide, which is to discuss kind of how Kaizen and Kata, I'm sorry, there was one more slide here, and I've already touched upon it, which is every step is an experiment, whether you're in the role of learner pursuing the improvement or in the role of coach and trying to hone your coaching craft. And it's kind of like your brain lifting weights, and you're developing what I call, or it's not my term, but what cognitive sciences call mental muscle memory and rewiring your neural pathways. And so now we'll go on to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how Kaizen and Kata play well together. And the temptation, before you have rewired your neural pathways and developed that new mental muscle memory, the temptation is to view it that, okay, maybe they're complementary, kind of best case scenario, or maybe they're competing methodologies, worst case scenario. And in fact, that's not really the case. They are symbiotic, I would say. And I want to dive into how that occurs. And Mark, please feel free to jump in at any time. But my hypothesis is that Kata reinforces Kaizen because, as we know, Kaizen is based on scientific method, and as you are doing PDCA cycles, it sure helps if you have people that have a strong scientific mindset. And what Kata does is allow us to develop those strong scientific thinkers in a more methodical manner, because the design of the Improvement Kata, Coaching Kata, is to do exactly that. The process improvement results you get is almost a byproduct of that. It's very important, but the design of it is to provide repetition, to provide the deliberate practice to create new mindsets, and that definitely is going to make your pursuit of Kaizen more scientific, more effective, I believe. Also, on the coaching front, if you are coaching your team on Kaizen, you are going to make mistakes. Just let's face it. When you first start coaching, it's tough. You're going to ask too many questions, not enough questions. You're going to ask questions that are too leading, that are giving too many of the answers, or more manipulative. And you want to become more of a Socratic, scientific coach. And the Coaching Kata provides the framework to develop that in spades. And then I would also add that practicing Kata gives your Kaizen efforts a little bit of direction and alignment, simply because there's a routine built into the Improvement Kata where we seek to understand the direction or the big challenge that we're facing. And if you don't have a great strategy deployment system in your organization to enable that, it might be difficult. You might be pursuing more of what I call point Kaizen, just isolated improvement efforts, if you don't have a good strategy deployment system in place to guide your Kaizen efforts. But Kata, even in the absence of a good strategy deployment system, can help create a little bit of direction and alignment. So that's the way that I perceive that Kata reinforces Kaizen. Now let's kind of flip the coin. I believe that Kaizen is very much enabled by Kata. Actually, let me flip that around and say that Kata is actually, I think, enabled by Kaizen, because as I've gone into organizations and attempted to practice Kata, if there was an organizational culture that did not really allow for words such as experimentation and learning, if a culture only really is concerned with what is the result, what have you done to improve cost, what have you done to improve efficiency, that sort of thing, you're just not going to be able to go through that rapid cycle of learning and that sort of thing, and it's very difficult. But if you have a culture predicated on Kaizen principles, now you have the natural, fertile environment for practicing your Kata and getting better as a learner and as a coach. And also, both methods are based on the scientific method, so there's no reason why you can't take let's say you have an existing Kaizen framework that's working for you, there's no reason to make wholesale big changes to that to be able to apply Kata principles to it. You can simply plug and play as you're pursuing improvements. Let's say you're doing it in your morning huddle, you're reviewing your idea board as part of your Kaizen system. There's no reason why you can't benefit from a little bit of discussion around what is the target condition, or what is the overall direction that we're pursuing, or some better coaching that comes through better practice of Kata. So it is very much just a plug and play kind of scenario. And in that way, I feel that the more you practice Kata, the more you do Kaizen, the more you see that they're very symbiotic in nature, and they're not alternatives to each other or complementary to each other, but rather they are almost mutually needed for each of them to perform at their highest levels. And so with that, I wanted to get away from some of this philosophical discussion and get more into some practical examples on the next slide.
Sure. And before you do that, I will take your invitation and jump in, just quickly make 2 points. I agree that there are really helpful ideas in the Kata framework, and Kaizen. Mike Rother in his book and his work are great, of course. Kaizen is also a learn by doing type practice. We can learn a little bit, but at some point we need to dive in and hopefully have somebody coaching us. That's one thing that's often a challenge. Leaders will make mistakes, employees will make mistakes, but we have to be, as you were saying, consistent in creating an environment where we don't punish mistakes, or otherwise, if the fear of making a mistake, if the fear of trying something that doesn't work out well, if that's the predominant mindset, people will be super cautious and then never attempt to improve. So I think it's just sort of
Right.
necessary to we don't want people doing wildly irresponsible things. That's where I think a leader as coach can help prevent that from happening without being horribly bureaucratic and slow like a suggestion box would be.
Exactly. And one other point I wanted to add is simply you can get better as a coach without kata. If you are doing Kaizen every day and engaging your team, you're going to get some awesome repetition. You're going to get some great improvement to your technique under your belt, and you're going to get good results. And so, and if you start to deliberately practice kata in addition to that, you can maybe even speed up the process a little bit. But there's no reason why, regardless of whether you're doing kata or not, you can't be constantly treating every coaching cycle as an experiment, and constantly honing your craft as a coach, and then doing as Mark suggests, being able to lead your people down the right path and not do irresponsible things.
Yeah. But I'll go ahead and advance that for you for your examples, Michael.
So I'm going to dive into one, which is barcode medication verification compliance. It's a patient safety technique, and we had this technology with the scanners and the armbands at a hospital I worked at for a while, but wasn't being properly utilized, and we had a nursing manager wanting to tackle this issue. And I'm wanting to kind of run through a couple of theoretical examples of how we could have led this improvement effort, and then I'm going to talk about how we actually led it. And I'm going to use, we're going to bring up a graphic from the previous slide, and you could advance that.
Oh, sure. Sorry. There you go.
So this is from a previous slide. So if we would have approached this issue of B&B compliance in the red, using the red box fashion, we could have just had the vendor of the CareFusion technology come in and just tell us, give us an audit checklist of how to increase compliance. We could have just mandated that we audit and did additional training for the staff, and that would have been okay. We would have seen some level of compliance improvement, but we would not have really done much to develop our people. That would have been the red. We could have taken the yellow approach, which was let's put together a unit-based council and let's have them brainstorm the top 10 ideas for how to improve compliance, and we could have prioritized those using the little dot matrix kind of things and dotmocracy, and we would have come up with some pretty good ideas, and we probably would have seen some improvement, and the staff would have probably been encouraged by the fact that they were able to own the solutions. But let's say we approached it in the green box fashion, which is actually what we attempted to do. We weren't very good at it, honestly. This was very early on in my practice of the coaching kata, and I was trying to guide this nursing manager as he was practicing the improvement kata, and we made a lot of mistakes. I mean, we came up with some of the very superficial solutions, such as let's do more training for the staff and let's audit the process, just like we would have came up with if we would have approached it in the red or yellow box fashion. But by doing cycle after cycle after cycle and seeing what didn't work over and over and over again, we started to develop this mental reflex, which was, okay, let's just take another step. Let's just take one more step. And eventually, through trial and error, we did uncover something that did work. It was related to the armbands washing out, and it was an issue with our materials management purchasing system. We were able to fix that and see an improvement. But beyond the improvement that we saw to patient safety, which is incredibly important, this nurse manager also started to develop a new reflex, a new mental muscle memory, and that was to always take another step forward. When in doubt, don't try to assume that you know the answer, but instead take a step forward, go to Gemba, do another cycle of PDCA, and see what you learn. And that was incredibly powerful for his development, and it was mine as a coach as well. And so that was just one example. On the next slide, We're going to give another example, and this one was related to patient boards. And if you've ever been in a patient's room in a hospital, you know that they typically have a whiteboard that can be incredibly useful in terms of getting the nurse and the doctor and other caregivers and the patient family all on the same page regarding the plan of care, the anticipated date of discharge, etc. It's a great way to improve visual communication, but we weren't really utilizing the boards very well, and therefore our visual communication was not very good. And we had a frontline nurse, a very clinical primary nurse, wanting to tackle this, who had never led any improvement work before. And I was very excited because I never coached a frontline clinical staff member using the coaching kata before. I'd mostly focused on supervisors, managers, directors. And so we jumped in. We started practicing our kata on this. And I'm going to run through a couple of examples, though. Again, Mark, if you can advance it to the graphic.
Yep.
So again, we could have had the, let's say we could have, researched using maybe there's a group called the Studer group that does the Studer model and includes patient whiteboards, and we could have gotten their evidence-based research and disseminated that and just audited against those principles, and that would have been kind of like the red box. We would have just been basically taking knowledge from elsewhere and applying it. We would have saw some improvements, but we wouldn't necessarily have gone through the learning cycle. And we could have done it the yellow way, another unit-based council Kaizen event maybe, and we would have probably maybe got some engagement from the physicians and the patient family even, and that would have been pretty impactful as well. But the way we approached it, again, was the green box fashion, which was to actually doing it in a way that promotes the development of new mindsets. And we basically had this primary nurse go through cycle after cycle of dealing with many obstacles, and you could see them as just little opportunities for Kaizen that added up to a whole bunch. For example, one of the things that he worked on was the markers on the board were always going dry, or the board was hard to erase. Little things like that he was able to tackle, making incremental improvements cycle after cycle, and sending messages out to the staff that says, we're not going to just assume that it's related to education and accountability for the staff, but rather we're going to make the job easier for you. And all these little incremental improvements started to add up. But then he started uncovering these other bigger issues related to, for example, the nurse and the doctor don't round together, so therefore they're not collaboratively using the board at the same time, which leads to the board not being used at all. And those are bigger and more complex issues, but again, cycle after cycle, this nurse is starting to get stronger, starting to see how he can uncover root cause just by going to do another cycle of PDCA, this empirical approach to root cause analysis. He's starting to uncover reasons why the nurse and doctor aren't rounding together. And so he's not only making improvement happen in an incremental, Kaizen fashion, but he's also starting to develop new mental models and new ways of looking at root cause analysis. And me as a coach, I'm starting to figure out new ways to coach, because now I'm coaching frontline nurses, I'm coaching physicians, and that sort of thing, which I was not very good at. And so this is giving me new skills. And so approaching it in the green box fashion has additional overall impact. So those are just a couple of examples of how approaching things in a Kaizen, Kata kind of manner, I think, can yield way more improvement than just the process improvement that was generated in the short term. So with that, I think we can advance to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about my experience with KaiNexus and how I think it is a great way to do kata. And so if you know anything about the KaiNexus platform or how it was created, Greg Jacobson, the founder of KaiNexus, he based a lot of the principles of KaiNexus on the book Gemma Kaizen by Masaki Imai. So there's Kaizen baked right into KaiNexus. And I was kind of from that background of my first endeavors with lean and process improvement in healthcare were based on Kaizen principles. So I loved it from the get-go. But as I started to experiment with kata, at first I wasn't sure exactly how I would merge the two. It really just goes back to the topic of how does kata and Kaizen, how do they support one another? And I started to realize over time through experimentation that the KaiNexus platform can really be useful when it comes to practicing your kata. And if you look at what they call an OI within KaiNexus, an opportunity for improvement, what you see on the screen here is an example of that. And traditionally in OI would be you see an issue, staff is empowered to submit that issue via their iPhone app or whatever, and then it creates a workflow. And you open up the OI, and it may have a description of the problem in the description box, and it may have a proposed solution in the proposed solution box. And when I started to see by making a little adjustment to that, we can really apply kata to it. So, Mark, if you could advance it one. So this proposed solution box, I think, can be reformatted slightly to become your target condition. So within a target condition, which may be a couple weeks or a couple months to be achieved, you're going to have multiple obstacles that arise, and each of those can be perceived as another opportunity for improvement to do PDCA on. And so in this model, if you advance it one more, Mark, you have target condition in the proposed solution box, you have the current condition in the current condition, or in the description box, and then one more, Mark, you have over on the bottom right in your OI tasks, you can use that for your iteration, for your rapid cycles of PDCA that are aimed at eliminating obstacles on the way to your target condition. So you can look at this overall box, this OI box, as being your target, your pursuit of your target condition, which may take a couple weeks to a couple months. And within that, your OI tasks panel is the rapid cycle daily iteration that you're doing to remove obstacles to get to your target condition. So very easy to plug and play KaiNexus with the Kata approach, and it's all based on Kaizen principles. So good synergy there. Anything you want to add on that, Mark, before we advance?
No. We've got some questions coming in, so I'll yield time to questions, and we'll move
Very
ahead.
Good. So originally I was going to go through a long conversation about how I've experimented with A3 and strategy deployment, and daily management system, and Kaizen events, and how through experimentation I've saw ways that Kaizen and Kata plays very well with all those different components of a lean transformation. But I'm just going to summarize it and say my experiments have shown me that they play very well, and I would encourage everybody on this webinar to start experimenting, because in your organization, you're probably already using some of these tools. You're probably using A3 or doing Kaizen events or value stream maps or whatever. Maybe you're using KaiNexus. Regardless of what your version of lean looks like, which should be specific to your situation, and there's no two lean transformations that are going to look alike, whatever you're currently deploying, go ahead and see if you can apply some Kaizen and Kata principles to that. And I will give one example, and it's actually, you see at the bottom of this slide where it says old-fashioned project management. That's going to exist in an organization. You're just going to have big projects, rolling out new technologies or building a new structure, a new factory or a new hospital. You're just going to have old-school project management going on, but even that can play well with Kaizen and Kata principles. And on the next slide, we're going to do another example real quick. So I was working with a hospital that was going to change locations. It was going to move from one side of town to the other side of the town, a relocation. And that's just classic old school project management. They had a big Gantt chart with hundreds of deliverables, and it was just tasks on a sheet of paper. And so the project management activity basically just devolves to the project manager, pestering everybody for updates on where they're at on their deliverables. And if you've been through big projects, you can probably relate to this feeling. So without any formal training on Kaizen or Kata, this organization was just beginning their lean journey, but without any formal structure or training in place, we just said, can we take all those deliverables and just turn them into sticky notes and put them up on a wall? And we said, okay, can we draw upon a classic Kaizen technique, which is to make ideas visual and make them flow by using some sort of visual control board, such as the one you're seeing on the screen here. Very classic technique. You have a column for to do, a column for doing, and then a column for done, and then you can see ideas flow from left to right. And so now we're starting to infuse a little bit of Kaizen mindset into this traditional project. And but then we started experimenting. We said, well, what about if we apply a little kata mentality to this as well? And we can break that middle column, the doing column, into two columns, and one of them can be what we're doing this week, which kind of becomes our, for lack of a better term, a target condition. Each of those sticky notes in that column is a target condition for that week, which is a classic kata principle. And then there's a column for doing today. And it's not that an idea flows from to do, to doing this week, to doing today, to done. It flows from to do to doing, and then at that point, that big deliverable, we pull daily little cycles of experiments out of that, and it goes in the daily column. So the parent sticker stays in the weekly column, while the child stickers stay in the daily column. And so you're promoting this idea of rapid cycle iteration, and it gives you a lot more opportunities to practice your coaching and to get the repetition you need to kind of rewire your mindset without having ever even introduced the word kata into the lexicon of this organization. And in that manner, I think anybody can start experimenting with how to infuse Kaizen and Kata into whatever your version of improvement or lean or Six Sigma or whatever it is in your organization. And in that way, I think you start to see the symbiotic nature of how these things all tie together. And again, not every idea is created equal. So the way you approach improvement matters. So if you're doing old school project management or whatever it is that you're doing to lead improvement, if you can just experiment with infusing a little Kaizen and Kata into the mix, I think you will see an additional impact of the ideas that are submitted and the ideas that are implemented. And in that way, you can really, any idea can be truly priceless. And priceless because when you start to change mindsets, anything is possible in the future. When you have a whole team of people thinking like scientists, you can tackle whatever big challenge comes before you.
Well, thanks so much for watching the recording of our webinar. To learn more, go to www.kinexus.com.